Good morning. 10 years ago tomorrow, at about 9:30, I believe, I was in my apartment in Rutherford, getting ready to go into work the next day, about to turn in to go in to bed, maybe about 11 o'clock, I would guess. And I'm watching television, and there is a bulletin coming up on my phone saying the president is going to address the nation late Sunday night. Now, I've been alive, at that time I'd been alive nearly 40 years. I've been through the Challenger disaster. I've been through 9/11. I've been through a lot of things. Whenever there is a statement from the president late on a Sunday night, it's either one of two things. It's either very bad or it's very good. Because if it's neither one, then they're going to wait till the next day. In this case, for us at least in the United States, it was very good. The man who had masterminded the attacks on 9/11, 2001, Osama Bin Laden, had been killed in a raid. Now, it took 8 years, or almost a decade, I should say, almost a decade to find him. And he was in Pakistan, a relatively urban area in Pakistan, all things considered. Apparently he wasn't hiding in a cave anywhere. And in retrospect, both members of the Obama administration and the Bush administration before that kind of had a little egg on their face because they thought, like most everybody else, that he was hiding out somewhere very remote. And apparently that was never actually the case. Well, it's been 10 years. The threat of Islamic terrorism is still there, but it's not anywhere near as bad as it was after 9/11. We still have ISIS to worry about in Syria and Iraq, but they have been decimated by continual assaults from both Syrian forces, both on the rebel side and the government side, and from Iraq. Al-Qaeda is nowhere near the menace it once was. Doesn't mean they can't be again. It could be they're laying low long term to kind of build their resources to strike at us again, or they simply are completely destroyed, and whatever remnants that do remain are more focused on trying to just keep the dream alive of overthrowing the West or whatever nonsense that is. Here's the thing. Let's go back between the time of 9/11 and the time that we finally got bin Laden. We became so consumed with the war on terror that we let the ball drop on a couple of countries we really should have been keeping our eye on. One is China. Now, before 9/11 happened, there was a bit of a controversy involving an American military plane landing in Chinese territory or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was a big hullabaloo in the media at the time. And tensions were raised up a bit. Then 9/11 happens and China gets pushed to the back and they take advantage of that, as you would expect an emerging superpower to do. They decided not to press the United States They decided instead to focus on expanding their own sphere of influence, and they've done that rather well in the last 20 years. And to the point where there is real concern about the South China Sea becoming a flare-up point because they've aggressively expanded their territory there. They've literally built islands in the middle of the sea to expand their reach to where they control the waters, and they can say what. And this is the most traveled waterway in the world. So much trade goes through that area, it's insane. And so they're wanting to control that. The Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries in that area aren't too keen about that. And then, of course, you've got Taiwan. Now, China is very smart. They know that any possible invasion of Taiwan is going to be very costly. They also know the United States knows this. And the United States does not want to risk a nuclear war with China over Taiwan. This is sort of the old-fashioned mutual assured destruction again, so to speak. The problem, of course, is that it's not just about that. It's about China trying to basically build its own empire after having to go through the colonialization period in its own country a little over a century ago. They had to deal, or about half a century ago, well over half a century ago. Basically, they've had to deal with the British, the Japanese taking advantage of them, and other countries taking advantage of them. And ever since the Communist Revolution there, they have made it to where America and the rest of the Western countries, and Japan too, are seen as colonial powers that are trying to hold back China. It is like, in a way, an abused child growing up to eventually abuse their children and their partners and their other people around them. That is a very, very accurate take on this, in my opinion. Because China knows what the Western countries did to them decades ago, and they want to make sure not only does it not happen to them, but they want to make sure they can dish out some of it as well so they can reap some of the benefits that were reaped from them back in the day. The problem with this is back then, we didn't really have nukes. And when we did get them, the British Empire was in decline. Japan had been defeated in World War II. The United States is more focused on Russia than China at the time, although we did have them in our radar soon enough in Korea and later Vietnam. The problem is that when you have these nukes nowadays, China can basically threaten to do something. You know, you go after Taiwan, we've got nukes. We can use them. The United States does not want to be hit by nuclear weapons. And it is not our policy, officially, to do first strikes. I'm sure that Donald Trump was tempted to change his mind, to change policy, I should say. But thankfully, that never happened. So it is official U.S. policy that we do not launch nuclear missiles first. We do that only when there is an attack imminent on us. Now, would China ever actually attack us with nuclear weapons? Well, here's the problem with that. The United States has more than enough weapons to wipe out not just China, but Russia, and pretty much the entire world. More than one time over. I'm not exactly sure how many, but we could easily decimate all life on the planet and still have plenty left in the tank. China might very well be in a similar situation. But more than likely they just have enough to wipe us out. And any country that would be allied to us, like Australia, Japan, South Korea, maybe India. So, during those 10 years I should say, between the time of 9/11 and the time we got Osama Bin Laden, we didn't completely ignore China, but the perception is that while we were busy fighting the war on terror, they were busy investing in their domestic economy, as well as expanding their spheres of influence in other countries. I hear all the time people complaining about sending aid to foreign countries. And I can understand that to a certain degree. But here's the problem. We want America to be the dominant force in the world leader, the superpower, the only superpower. That comes with a price tag. That means you've got to give aid to countries in Africa, in South America, in Asia, so that they are on our side, because China's got deep pockets. Russia has deep pockets too, although both countries tend to neglect their citizens for that. And you could argue the case that we do the same thing here. The problem is, if we don't do it, if we retract from all this foreign spending, Russia and China are going to fill the void, and in fact they already have. And do you want countries like Honduras, Guatemala, perhaps even Mexico under the influence of China and Russia? It will not be as obvious as communism versus capitalism this time around. It will be about two countries. Now, China technically is still a communist state, but look at their economy. Look at the way they are communist in name only. It is a totalitarian system that is all about preserving the corporate. If anything else, you could probably call them fascist and not communist, because there's a lot of profit-making businesses over there. Now, granted, the state does own quite a lot of other businesses, don't get me wrong, but it's not the capitalist society that Mao Zedong tried to make. It is far different. It is modern. It is very much about making money and gaining power. You make the money, you make the power. That's what China's doing. Now, China and us, the United States, are big rivals, but there's another big rival. Not just to us, but to China, even though China and Russia are kind of buddy-buddy right now. There's a reason for that. For the last 20 years, I'll go back to between the period of 9/11 and catching bin Laden, we really didn't do a whole lot with Russia. There was the thing in 2008 with Georgia that kind of got Russia back on our radar to a degree, but Russia kind of went underneath the radar for most people. That was Vladimir Putin's brilliant idea. He was ostensibly our ally fighting the war on terror in Chechnya. The reality was there were no good people in Chechnya, neither the Russians or the Chechens. The Chechen rebels, I should say. The problem is, Vladimir Putin was basically wanting to bring about the old influence of the Soviet Union without actually having the communist regime. He liked the oligarchy they have now. He liked the money coming in now. He liked the fact that the consumer goods were there. The people felt that they were prosperous. There's a lot of money being made in oil and natural gas and whatnot from Russia. The problem is Russian corruption has squandered a lot of that. The oligarchs, the bureaucracy. In many cases, the average everyday folks in Russia are really not a whole lot better off now than they were under the communist regime. Yes, they got some fun TV they can watch. Yes, they've got a few extra consumer goods and all of that, but it's not really a whole lot better for them in their daily life. And in fact, one could argue it's probably worse, because instead of your neighbors looking, it could be the secret police. It's going to be someone that's not so secret. You raise up an opposition to Vladimir Putin, you may not live very long. So, with all this being said, why have I mentioned a whole lot about Russia and China, not talked about a lot about terrorism, Islamic terrorism? Well, it's not really been that big of a threat to us directly here in the United States for a decade now, ever since Osama Bin Laden died. The main reason for that is that up to that point, we had been pretty much decimating Al-Qaeda, and we've kept up to it. Now, ISIS, of course, was a threat, and they've done some stuff here, some small things here, but it's basically not what you would expect to be happening on a regular basis. Now, they've done stuff in Europe and all that, so it's not completely gone away. The problem is they know the price they will pay if they attack us again like they did on 9/11. And there is the rub. Did we clamp down so very hard that they realize that attacking the United States is not worth it in the long term? Now, one could argue that we could have done a lot better had we not go into Iraq, because Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. That is very much true. They did. And one could argue that because we went into Iraq, we actually continued the war on terror way beyond where it should have been. But here's the problem. Terrorism isn't a country. It's not defined by borders. There is no army that you can see from the sky. It's guerrilla warfare at a much more elaborate level. Look at what happened on 9/11. Box cutters were used. No nuclear weapons, no chemical weapons, no biological weapons. Up until that point, that was the real thing we were worried about. And we still are worried about it when you think about it. The problem is that this very small thing, box cutters, getting on board, took down 4 planes, took down 2 buildings, damaged the defense department of this country, and had it not been for some brave souls on Flight 93, either the White House or the Capitol building would have been hit. Even if they had been completely evacuated, the fact that the White House and the Capitol building were hit with a plane too would have made things even worse than they already were. The thing about terrorism is it's not so much about how many people you kill or injure. It's the fear created afterwards. For almost 20 years now, we've lived in the fear of another 9/11 or worse. When in reality, we are more in danger of an attack from Russia and China than anything else. And of course, there is North Korea. and we should concern ourselves about North Korea. Because in a sense, that is where the flare-up could very well begin between us and China. Now, officially, China has told us that if North Korea were to attack the United States directly, or South Korea, or Japan directly, they would stay out of the way, and the United States could attack, and South Korea and Japan could attack North Korea and do what they've got to do, so long as China was not attacked itself. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Here's the problem with that. North Korea is not a very big country. And China, it would be very worried about U.S. troops very close to the China border if we were to take down North Korea and basically merge the two under the South Korean government. China would want to have U.S. troops stay as far away from their border as possible. South Korea would almost certainly want to put troops at the border because they would be concerned about China invading the northern part of Korea, of a reunified Korea, if that ever happens. And the last time they did that during the Korean War, they darn near won the whole thing. If you look at the history, that invasion nearly succeeded. And that's a war that we tend to forget in the United States because World War II is so big in our culture and Vietnam is so big in our culture. The only two television series I can tell you that talk anything about the Korean War in modern times is MASH, obviously, and Good Times of all things, because James Evans, who was played by John Amos, was a Korean War vet. You don't really hear that much about the Korean War in popular culture. It only lasted 3 years or so. The TV series MASH lasted 4 times longer than the actual war did. The war is still technically going on, though. The armistice has been lasting for well over almost 60 years now, maybe getting close to 70 years now. But there have been a lot of tensions. Now, here's my theory about North Korea. North Korea knows that if they attack the United States directly, that China will not come to its aid. Moreover, if China fears that North Korea is going to attack the United States, they may decide to go in and clean house and take over things for themselves, putting in a puppet government there to keep North Korea from blowing up the whole world. China does not want a war with the United States, but they do want Taiwan. They do want to get rid of that pesky 50-year agreement with Britain about Hong Kong. And they are pressing ever so gently, or in some cases not so gently, for Hong Kong to be a fully incorporated territory of China. The British and us and other Western countries want to hold China to the agreement with Hong Kong for the full 50 years, in the hopes that by the end of the 50 years, China will be more receptive to Hong Kong having more independence, more autonomy, and perhaps even China itself being more friendly toward democracy itself. In the almost a quarter of a century since Britain formally left Hong Kong, that has been anything but the truth. If anything else, the Chinese government has become much more hardcore in their pursuit of fully immersing Hong Kong into China. They're slowly trying to de-Westernize Hong Kong, despite what their citizens may want. We've all seen it. It's pretty obvious. Now, what does this have anything to do with what happened 10 years ago tomorrow? Because this is a big chess game. Osama Bin Laden's forces are out of it, for the most part. If Islamic terrorism is to become a more broader international concern, it'll have to be somebody else other than Al-Qaeda. Will ISIS do it? That remains to be seen. They're pretty much almost finished completely these days, but there's always going to be some other group. Because Saudi Arabia and Iran want to have their piece of the puzzle in world politics. Here's the thing. Why is it that we're so cozy with Saudi Arabia, and yet Saudi Arabia funds a lot of these terrorists? It's because up until 1979, we were not friendly with Saudi Arabia. They were the bad guys because the Shah of Iran was on the throne of Iran. And Iran was the good guys. But Saudi Arabia could control the Strait of Hormuz, which is where a lot of the oil from Iran and Iraq comes through in Saudi Arabia to a certain degree. So, in the 70s, we had a lot of embargoes that were quite punishing. Reagan comes to power at the same time that a couple years before he does, there's the hostage crisis in Iran when the Shah is deposed and 58 hostages were taken by Iranian students at the American embassy, held for 444 days, and not released until Ronald Reagan becomes president on Inauguration Day. Iran became the bad guy, allegedly. Saudi Arabia became the good guy, allegedly, for the United States. They became a staunch ally all of a sudden. And Iraq became an ally for a brief period of time. Because at the same time all this is going on, Iran and Iraq are at war. In a war that lasted from 1980 to 1988, which ended in a stalemate. Neither country won, but a lot of people got killed. And more importantly, Saddam Hussein gained a lot of swagger. He wanted more oil to expand his empire. He only had a small little sliver on the Gulf Coast, Persian Gulf Coast. He wanted Kuwait. He kept his ambitions secret. But we all know what happened. August 2nd, 1990, he invades Kuwait. And that scares the entire world. Because if he's going after Kuwait today, what about Saudi Arabia tomorrow? There's a reason we fought the first Gulf War. It was for oil. But more primarily, it was to protect our interest in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The access to this oil. There was also fear that in Iran, that if Iraq did conquer Saudi Arabia and the West didn't really do anything about it, the next eyes would turn, Saddam's eyes would turn to Iran again. And this time he would have all the wealth of the Saudis, presumably to buy arms to prepare in a war against Iran. That would be more well-financed, He'd have more weapons, and more than likely more troops, and perhaps even better troops. And more importantly, he might have convinced the United States of America that he was in the right after all. It's interesting to note that up until August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein and the United States were on fairly good terms. We weren't allies, but we'd helped them in their war against Iran. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And before the invasion of Kuwait, we were more ideally suited to support Iraq if they were going up against Iran. Was this a miscalculation on the part of Saddam Hussein to think that the Americans would support an invasion of Kuwait and they would simply look the other way? That has been discussed for 30 years now, because there is this belief that there were some mixed signals about what the United States would do if Saddam Hussein's forces were to invade Kuwait. Now, the reason I bring this up is Osama Bin Laden in the 1980s in Afghanistan was actually our ally. The reason for that was that the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. We wanted the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and guess who was fighting a war, a holy war against the Soviets in Afghanistan? Osama bin Laden and many of the people that would later become Al-Qaeda. We armed them, trained them, and eventually won the war. We helped the Taliban and Osama bin Laden's group force the Soviets to leave around 1987-88. Eventually pulled out. It was no longer worth their efforts. To them and to Russia, it's considered their version of Vietnam, a war that they lost and eventually, it could be argued, led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Although that's not the only reason, not even really the major reason. So up until the Gulf War, Al-Qaeda and the United States were essentially on the same page. They were keeping Russia in check, and they were keeping Iran in check. And essentially, Osama bin Laden didn't really like Iran either. He didn't really like Saddam Hussein either. That's why a lot of people who don't really know assume that Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden were on the same side. That's very much wrong. Osama bin Laden would have loved nothing more than to overthrow Saddam Hussein and turn Iraq into his own personal religious empire. Because Saddam Hussein was more of a secular leader who only used Islam whenever it politically benefited him. Now, in 1990, when we started sending troops to Saudi Arabia, this was angering folks like Osama bin Laden and those allied with him. They saw Saudi Arabia, the entirety of it, as holy soil. And they didn't want American troops, Western troops there, defiling their land, according to them, and waging a war against other Muslims, even the ones that they disagreed with, vehemently in some cases. This was not just about religion. This was about the fact that, in some ways, Osama bin Laden liked the idea of Saddam Hussein being a threat to Saudi Arabia. It meant that maybe Osama bin Laden could topple the Saudi government, take over for himself, perhaps, or have people that were allied with his cause take over for him. And perhaps with Iran and Iraq fighting once again, Osama bin Laden-led Saudi Arabia could go in and take what they want from Iraq. And that might lead to the big war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who have been rivals for a very long time in the Middle East. And one could say they've probably been rivals a lot longer before there was even Iran and a Saudi Arabia. Why do I mention all this? Well, obviously, what the Gulf War fueled Osama bin Laden's hatred for the United States, because he felt they defiled their Holy Land by putting troops there to invade a Muslim country. That's why we had the World Trade Center's attacks of 1993. Some of you may never have heard of them. You're too young to remember this. Just a couple of months into Bill Clinton's administration, the World Trade Centers were bombed. A truck bomb. A few people were killed. A lot of people were injured. A lot more people were scared witless. If you want to go see how traumatic this was, go on YouTube and look for the news footage. Now, in the time after that, there were masterminds arrested, and we thought we'd essentially dodged a bullet. What happened was, Osama bin Laden went, okay, we got to take down that target. They think that they escaped because we didn't take down their precious building, their symbol of Western decadence and economic prosperity. That made the building more of a target than ever before. That's why 8 years later, a little over 8 years later, we had 9/11. We all know what happened there. Osama bin Laden, throughout the 90s, was not exactly a hidden secret. One could argue that Bill Clinton didn't go far enough to get him. One could also argue that the previous administrations before Clinton didn't do enough to go after these terrorists either. Middle Eastern terrorism is nothing really new. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the Munich attack during the Olympics, when Palestinian terrorists attacked the Israeli rooms in the Olympic Village, took hostages. Eventually, they were transferred to the airport. The then West German police wanted to set up an ambush to free the hostages and take down the terrorists. It went wrong. Many of the terrorists were killed, and all the hostages were killed. It was a complete debacle. That was the first major experience West Americans had to terrorism on a grand scale. Throughout the 70s and 80s, it was mainly a European thing. It did affect Americans because at the time Beirut was undergoing a massive civil war, plus intervention from Israel, the PLO, and Syria. So Beirut which had been in the 50s and 60s a rather luxurious place, a boomtown at times, in the 80s became a hellhole. Americans who were there were taken hostage on a regular basis and held by various forces, demanding ransom of some kind. Prisoners being released, troops being removed, and money, obviously. Some were released, some weren't. Ten years ago was a very big time. 10 years ago tomorrow was a very big time. We got the guy that got us on 9/11. The problem was why we had a 9/11. This is the thing about history. You could make the argument that the United States, through its actions in the Middle East, caused 9/11. You would not be right, but you would not be wrong either, and here's why. You can do a lot of things in your interest that, in your mind, and in the minds of your citizens, are a good thing, and perhaps even the minds of most of the world are considered a good thing. And yet, they could come back and backfire on you anyway. Life is not fair. It never has been, never will be. We try to make it as fair as possible. I think you should try to make it as fair as possible. But to say we'll have a day where life is 100% fair will never happen. The good guys don't always win. The bad guys don't always lose. In some cases, neither side wins. In some cases, neither side really loses. There are a lot of people who like to see the world in black and white. Sadly, it's been my experience that the more people try that way, the more the stark reality is the world is full of gray. There is precious little black and white. Clear-cut, yes, clear-cut good guys and bad guys. The thing about Osama bin Laden, the thing that made him a great villain in the eyes of the world, was the fact when deep down inside Osama bin Laden thought he was the hero. He thought he was the good guy. He thought he was the guy doing the right thing in his mind. People want to talk about, well, Osama bin Laden was pure evil and all this. They fail to understand that that's our perspective. To his target audience, he was the hero. Or he was somebody to be admired. He wanted to be a martyr. He wanted to inspire millions upon millions, perhaps even the billion plus Muslims in the world to rise up against Christendom, which includes the United States, by the way, and to bring up, a worldwide caliphate. That was his mind. That was his goal. Now, the chances of him ever pulling that off were pretty much impossible. There have been leaders trying to conquer the world ever since the world began. Napoleon failed, Genghis Khan failed, Hitler failed, Stalin failed, because Stalin didn't really try, although he probably dreamt of it. We haven't, because we never really wanted to conquer by sheer military force. 20 years after 9/11, the one thing that we fail to understand is that there are multiple threats. Our military was transitioned under the Bush administration to fight more of a terrorist war, as well as a war in the Middle East. What they failed to understand, and I'll say Obama and to a certain degree even Trump failed to understand, is that the new conflicts are going to be old enemies, Russia and China. There is a new Cold War coming, more than likely. But instead of clearly defined lines like communism versus capitalism, it's national pride. It's sheer geopolitical power. Russia, for all intents and purposes, is a capitalist society. China, even though they claim they're still communist and they still have some state-owned industries, is more capitalist than they are communist. I refer to them as communist in name only. The only real reason they even still have state-oriented industry is so that it can help fuel the private industry with these massive public projects, some of which bombed disastrously. There's plenty of evidence. There's entire huge cities in China that are completely deserted because they're too expensive to live in. China's propping up their economy. Not everything in China is as good as they want you to think it is. The same in Russia. There's a lot of unrest in Russia. The economy isn't as good as Putin would like it to be, to quell the masses. So the one thing throughout history in totalitarian regimes to help keep them in power when the people are not satisfied with what's going on at home is an external enemy. And guess who the external enemy of Russia and China is? Us, the United States. And in the 20 years since 9/11, Russia and China have grown tremendously in their influence. Russia is building up her military. China is building up their military, but they're not wanting to necessarily fight a war of conquest yet. Russia might be more inclined to do it, but China's more of a defensive. They want to take Taiwan, but they know we don't want them to take Taiwan. They want to control the South China Sea. But more importantly, they know that we don't want them to, and that if they invade Taiwan or they try to take the South China Sea completely for themselves, we may have to intervene because of treaty obligations. Or the United States would run the risk of breaking those treaties and having our reputation damaged. Russia isn't like the old Soviet Union. They don't have the Eastern Bloc anymore. But there are allies. Belarus is an ally of Putin. But that's really all. The Baltic states don't really care for him. Poland doesn't. And of course there's Ukraine, who he is dealing with militarily in its east. And there's where the flashpoint's going to be. The two big flashpoints that we're going to have to keep an eye on for quite a long time. When it comes to China, it's Taiwan and North Korea. When it comes to Russia, to a lesser extent, it's the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Latvia, I should say. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. But more importantly, Ukraine. 7 years ago, Russia took over Crimea. There were a lot of hemming and hawing about military action back then, if you remember. Nothing ever came about it. Don't think that didn't go unnoticed by Vladimir Putin and his people in the Kremlin. And then there's Turkey. Why do I mention Turkey? Well, Turkey is very close to Iraq and Syria and Iran. They used to be a staunch ally. And then Erdogan became president, who wanted to move the traditional secular government of Turkey back to a more religious fundamentalist to enhance his own power. This does not go unnoticed by Russia or China. And if you know anything about the geography there, there's straits there to get to the Black Sea. If Russia were to invade Ukraine and NATO were to want to intervene, there's only two ways they can do it. Either via land or air through Eastern Europe to Ukraine, which, given the borders, those countries would have to be consulted, some of which are part of NATO, some of which are not. And then, of course, there is going through the straits. Hang on a second. Alexa, what are the straits leading to the Black Sea?
Is a form of the word strait. As a noun, strait can have
Alexa,
meanings.
What is the straits around Istanbul?
A noun. Strength.
Alexa, stop. Alexa, what's the straits leading from the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea?
Sorry, I don't know that.
Never mind. Let me do it real quick. Is it Hormuz? I don't think it's Hormuz. I think that's no. Strait of... Oh, foot. Hang on. I'm drawing a blank here. Bosphorus Straits. Thank you. Bosphorus Straits. Okay. I was really drawing a blank there. Normally I don't do that. It's part of getting old. I turned 50 a week from tomorrow, by the way. The Bosphorus is the Straits. This is a very historic area because 1453, the Turks overran what was known as Constantinople. You know the song "They Might Be Giants." It's Istanbul, not Constantinople. Blah 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 blah. Here's the problem. Here's the problem. That is a very strategic location to deal with Russia. Turkey is technically a NATO ally. But given Erdogan is no longer a friend of the United States, he may not be counted upon to help if there is a conflict between NATO and Russia over Ukraine. What happens if the United States, NATO goes to conflict to aid Ukraine in a battle against Russia? And the United States and NATO forces were to send naval forces through the straits of the Bosphorus Straits, try to at least, only for Turkey to decide they're going to blockade them because they're concerned that Russia might invade them, or Russia and Turkey more than likely have cut a deal. And Turkey has decided to say to hell with NATO, and we're going to become part of Russia's sphere of influence. Vladimir Putin knows the lessons of the Cold War very well. He wants to avenge the loss that Russia had in the Cold War. He wants to expand Russia's influence and build his own Russian empire. Whether that's through sheer conquest or through building spheres of influence remains to be seen. The thing about Vladimir Putin is he's not really a young man. But he's not exactly old either. He's 68 years old. He is going to be in charge of Russia up until 2032, something like that? Yeah, they still hold elections, but let's face it. The man's been in charge of Russia since essentially 1999, when Boris Yeltsin pretty much was put out to pasture. I think it was term limited. And he's been president of Russia since 2012. He was the prime minister during that time, between the two presidential periods. But the funny thing is that he pretty much kept all his power. If anything, he probably consolidated it more during that time. He doesn't have any sons, he has 2 daughters. So, why should we be more concerned about Vladimir Putin than any potential successor to Osama Bin Laden? Because it'll be a lot harder to kill Vladimir Putin. And because the consequences of killing Vladimir Putin would almost certainly be nuclear war. And not only that, if we kill Putin, who do we get in his stead? You see, the thing about Al-Qaeda was, up until the point we killed Osama Bin Laden, we had been giving them a lot of body blows, like in boxing terms. Osama Bin Laden was the head. We finally got the head. But up until that point, we had been giving a lot of body blows. We got this official, we got that official, we killed this person, we got that person. We wrecked the structure of Al-Qaeda. And not just through military action. We also froze assets, went after their finances, went after their organizational power, used propaganda against him. That whole situation helped bring about the end of Al-Qaeda as a major force of terrorism in the world. They're still out there, don't get me wrong. And who knows, with the right leadership or the right leaders, they could conceivably become a threat again one day. They cannot be ignored. ISIS is still out there. They're not nearly as powerful as they were a few years ago, but they're still out there. Terrorism there is no capital to overrun, there's no territory to conquer, to say, hey, we have beaten this enemy. When we overran Berlin and killed Hitler, or Hitler killed himself, and we took over Nazi Germany, that was the end of the European part of the conflict of World War II. We forced Japan to surrender because there was leadership in Japan that were offered to surrender, that had the power to enforce a surrender. How do you enforce a surrender from a terrorist group when, let's say, one of their leaders decides, okay, we'll surrender? Other people can go, well, no, we're not going to surrender. We'll just get a new leader. They have no borders. They really don't have defined armies and barracks and such, as you can see from space. And this is something Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in China, the leader of China, know. Because the terrorist groups aren't necessarily going after China and Russia. Because unlike us, Russia and China aren't afraid to kill people. Like what China's doing in their western provinces where Islam is prevalent. Russia's done similar things. So why have I spent most of this podcast reflecting on the anniversary of the attack that killed Osama Bin Laden, talking about Russia and China and everything but Osama Bin Laden, pretty much? Because Osama Bin Laden's goal was to bring down America. He didn't care how he did it, as long as it happened. In the last 20 years, we have done more to tear each other apart here in this country than come together. Some of that could be blamed for propaganda coming out of Russia, and to an extent China. But in some cases, it's because Osama bin Laden knew about how to push our buttons, what worked and what didn't work. Russia and China want to make America a second world nation. They'd love to see the United States split up. They'd love to see Texas secede, California secede, other states secede. They want destabilization. There's a reason Russia's been hacking our systems. China's been doing the same thing. And to a certain extent, Iran. It wouldn't surprise me if other nations are involved that we don't know about. There is a global drive for power going on right now. And we're not winning it. We used to win it, but we're not anymore. Do I think that Biden gives us a chance to win it? I'm not certain. Under Trump, that wasn't happening. A lot of people say, well, he was strong, he was tough. No, he wasn't. He wanted to isolate us from our allies. He wanted to bang his fist and say a lot of things, but he was pissing off the very people that could help us in this fight. And we need help in this fight. We can't just manage it alone. And of course, there is the possibility that he could have been having been compromised by Russia in some way or working with Russia in some way. That is to still be found out about. I'm going to finish up by saying this. One day in the distant future, 9/11 will be like Pearl Harbor, just another day. It shouldn't be, but it will be. It may be by the time my niece gets my age, or her children get my age. She doesn't have any children right now. She's not even married, still in college. But there will come a day she has children. And when those children are in their 40s or 50s, there is the possibility, and this will be around 2060, 2070, that to them, 9/11 will be like Pearl Harbor. That Islamic terrorism will be a thing of the past. The problem is, will they be living in a country known as the United States, or formerly known as the United States? Or still the United States, but not as we know them now. But great nations don't last forever. We know this. The United States is 5 years away from celebrating its 250th anniversary. There is no guarantee that we'll get there. The date will get here, surely. But will we be a country by then? A decade ago, I'd have said, oh yeah, sure. We'll definitely get there. Given the disruptions we've seen in recent years because of Trump, because of the response to Trump from not Al-Qaeda, but QAnon and Proud Boys and those responding to them like the Antifa movement and Black Lives Matter and whatnot. Sorry, I got to chew some gum to lubricate my throat, start some saliva up to lubricate my throat. There is no guarantee that 5 years from this July 4th, that we'll still be a country. The odds are strong for it, don't get me wrong. But it is not a dead certainty, like we would have thought on May 1st, 2011, when Osama Bin Laden bit the bullet finally. He's been dead for for a decade now. He may be in hell. We don't know. If he is, he's probably smiling at seeing what we're going through right now. Because in the end, to him it didn't matter what happened to him. It's as long as the United States falls. And right now, if you look at where we're at in this country, we're not where we were 10 years ago. Whose fault is that? Is it Obama's? Not entirely. A lot of it is a right wing that has gone from being the party of Reagan to being the party of Trump, from being center right, which Reagan was, to being far right to the point of fascism. You have people who believe the FBI is part of a deep state to try and get Trump and therefore get Trump's people, namely the people in the MAGA movement and the QAnon movement and such. and they see themselves as being the victims. The problem is, of course, they're not. At least not the victims of the people that they think they're being who they feel are victimizing them. They're the victims of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and others who wish to bring this country down. They claim themselves to be patriots when in reality they are doing the very work that is the antithesis of patriotism. Instead of unifying the country, they are dividing it. They do not see the enemy for what it is. It is not Joe Biden. It is not Barack Obama. It is not Hillary Clinton. It is people who would be willing to compromise leaders of our country to force this country to break itself apart. And trust me, I don't think the Democrats are entirely clean in any of this, but they're not nearly as dirty as the Republicans. I've talked about it before on podcasts. Why is it that there is such a strong connection between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? And why is it that Donald Trump does not want you to know anything about that connection? What's he hiding? What's his kids hiding? What are the people around him hiding about that connection? It could prove to be proved to be exponentially more damaging to the United States than anything Osama Bin Laden could ever do. Because unlike Osama Bin Laden, Vladimir Putin knows a way to use the American people to turn against themselves. And that was something Osama Bin Laden wishes he could have done. Or maybe that was the whole point of 9/11. Getting the United States to become a hypo-patriotic country again, to turn far right-wing, to start banging the drums of war again, knowing that a Vietnam kind of deal may happen again, the kind of instability we saw in the 60s and 70s, the kind of instability that Russia and to a certain extent China exploited, although not as good as they would like to have because they had their own issues. History sometimes repeats itself. Sometimes it takes centuries, sometimes it takes decades, sometimes it takes a few years. We are in another Cold War. It's not the Soviet Union or communism again. It's basically sheer, raw, capitalistic geopolitical power. It's democracy in the liberal sense against authoritarianism and corporate oligarchy. That's the real battle. Terrorism is still out there. It may very well strike us again. It may strike us perhaps even harder because we are more focused on Russia and China than ever before. It may not strike us now. It may not strike us for another decade. But more than likely we'll see another attack. Probably not from Al-Qaeda, probably not from ISIS, but perhaps another group, perhaps even a country supporting a terrorist group openly. Because they may have allies in Russia or China. That's the battle you've got to really watch out for. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. I'm not claiming I'm the greatest expert on all this, but I've paid a lot of attention. I've read a lot about all this, and I can tell you, it scares the hell out of me. It was a great day 10 years ago tomorrow. I wish we could have built upon it. For everybody, or just me, I should say, take it easy. Bye for now.